The hearing is reconvened, and our very distinguished second panel will now be recognized. And first we'll ask Dr. Stephen Running, who is a distinguished forest ecologist who has published over 240 scientific articles as a chapter lead author for the fourth assessment of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Dr. Running shares the recently announced Nobel Peace Prize with his colleagues, and we extend our congratulations to you, Dr. Running. He is a professor at the University of Montana and a fellow of the American Geophysical Union, and he is a recognized expert on climate modeling and specifically on the impacts of climate change in North America. So we welcome you, Doctor. Whenever you're ready, please begin.
Good morning, Chairman Markey and members of this select committee. I thank you for the opportunity to come and testify on wildfire and climate change. And I think what I want to do, rather than going through much of my prepared discussion, which has been covered at length this morning, I want to really focus on a couple of issues that I think are particularly important for this committee to understand. And so first, for the record, as an IPCC author, let me read the exact text that I put in the IPCC report. Since 1980, an average of 22,000 kilometers squared per year has burned in U.S. wildfires, almost twice the average from 1920 to 1980. The forested area burned in the western U.S. from 1987 to 2003 is 6.7 times the area burned from 1970 to 1986. The wildfire burned area in the North American boreal region has increased from 6,500 square kilometers per year in the 1960s to 29,700 square kilometers per year in the 1990s. And as of October 29th, we've now burned 8.7 million acres of land in the U.S. this year. So this are the statistics I put in the IPCC report, and I think what I want to just make two critical points with the time that we have here. When we look at the causes, what's causing this real acceleration in wildfire? There's four important trends that we are aware of. Clearly, our forests and rangeland have grown back over the last century from overgrazing and overlogging in the 1800s. So some of this is a natural ecological recovery. We add to that a second factor of the fire suppression, and we've already heard about that from the chief earlier this morning. 98% of the fires are now suppressed, so we really have ecosystems throughout the country that are growing back to a point where they've actually overgrown the carrying capacity of the landscape. And a fire is a natural way for an ecosystem to return to its natural equilibrium, and we've taken that equilibrium away by suppressing the fires. So in a way, you might think that our ecosystems have overshot the climate that would support the forests, particularly in the West. I want to make then the second point of how important snowmelt and snowpack is for all of the northern forests. Obviously, snow is a natural fire retardant. When there's snow on the ground, nothing's going to burn. And we now see snow melting 1 to 4 weeks earlier than we did 50 years ago. That's not only lengthening the fire season, but it's bringing forests at higher elevation into a vulnerable condition of drought that didn't used to happen, just literally because there was snow on the ground. And so the acceleration of wildfire in the wild western forests is very much a function of this early snowmelt. The last point I want to make is where the future is going. And for IPCC, there were over a dozen climate models run hundreds of different times. In my written testimony on Figure 4, I showed the results of what all these GCMs project for the future. And I summarized just a single graph to save time. And basically that one graph, this is a consensus of 7 different GCMs, is that the Western North America summertime temperatures will be 3 to 5 degrees centigrade warmer than they are now in about 50 years.
Which translates in Fahrenheit to?
To about 5 to 8 degrees Fahrenheit. Warmer in 50 years. And the important point, and it's already been discussed, there'll be no increases in precipitation. And so I can only conclude from the best GCMs run for the IPCC report that the western U.S. in particular is in for longer, hotter summers, and I can conclude nothing else, but that's going to increase wildfire dynamics.
Okay. So
I think with that, my time is up, and those are the key points I want to make.
Okay, so
Thank
it's 5 to 8 degrees warmer and
No more rain.
No more rain.
Yeah.
Over the next 50 years. All right, our next witness is Dr. Michael Mendler. Dr. Mendler is an expert on fire ecology and wildland firefighting. He is currently a professor of environmental studies at Western Washington University. He is also the president-elect of the Association for Fire Ecology and a member of the Firefighters United for Safety, Ethics, and Ecology. Dr. Mendler's research focuses on analysis of historical wildfire patterns in western United States. He actually was a wildland firefighter during the 1980s in the Willamette National Forest in Oregon and helped fight the historic Yellowstone fires of 1988. So we thank you, Dr. Mendler. Whenever you're ready, please begin.
Well, thank you, Chairman Markey and members of the committee. I want to thank you for this opportunity to testify on climate change and fire management. As you said, I'm a president-elect of the Association for Fire Ecology and also a member of the Firefighters United for Safety, Ethics, and Ecology. And many of the important scientific points have been made quite well today, but I'd like to make a few other points about fire management in particular and firefighting. As you said, I worked as a firefighter in the Forest Service in the 80s and really cut my teeth at the Yellowstone fires in 1988. And it's been a while since I've had a boots on and cut fire line, but the members of AFE and FUSI, some fun acronyms, are currently serving on the fire lines, even now in Southern California, and would like me to talk about some of our shared concerns about changes in fire behavior resulting from climate change. Fire behavior is changing. In Yellowstone in 1988, the grizzled old fire dogs told us that we'd never see fire behavior like that again, because they never had. Now, most summers bring us new record-breaking fires and fire seasons, and the fires we call big today can be 10 times as big as the ones 20 years ago. On the fire lines, it's really clear that global warming, global climate change is changing fire behavior and creating bigger and more severe fires. And we've had a fair bit of testimony to that extent. But this isn't the only news here. Many firefighters we know have commented that they're facing more extreme fire behavior than they've ever witnessed. And among fire scientists, there's a broad consensus that these changes in fire frequency, size, and severity will continue to occur. So weather does drive a lot of these fire events. We're experiencing weather phenomena that are unprecedented in the historical record. And because of these changing patterns, as many people have pointed out here, the wildfire season in the West is roughly 78 days longer than in 1987, a really profound change. You know, this is a taxing and the endurance of the firefighting crews and draining budgets of land management agencies, as we've heard. Because of this unprecedented behavior, firefighters have been forced to change strategy and tactics. Perimeter control and its tactics of anchor, flank, and hold fires have been almost futile in recent megafires. Firefighters in the Northern Rockies had to give up aggressively fighting fires because it was extremely unsafe and almost completely ineffective. Instead, they adopted a strategy of indirect attack and point protection to make sure individual homes and communities were protected. And they're forced to light very large backfires that were also burning with high severity. Meanwhile, communities are sprawling into high danger areas. With severe weather conditions, firefighters are often unable to stop fire from spreading into vulnerable communities, and this will be a factor all over the country, not just the West. Unfortunately, development patterns and the designs of homes rarely consider wildland fire at this point, and this is putting both homeowners and firefighters in harm's way, as we've seen recently. Firefighters are rightly becoming unwilling to risk their lives to protect individual homes that are located in absurdly indefensible locations, like at the top of narrow chimney canyons, or built with highly combustible materials, or completely surrounded by dense flammable vegetation. There are two kinds of fire requiring two very different sets of fire policies. Fire management policies need to distinguish between backcountry wildlands, many of which are comprised of fire-adapted ecosystems, and front country communities with built environments, many of which are largely unprepared for wildfire. Conflating wildland fire policies and urban fire policies will lead to inappropriate forest management and ineffective community protection policies. Stated simply, if our homes and communities were far more fire resistant, we would have fire as a tool rather than an enemy in the backcountry. Ecological restoration programs could carefully reintroduce fire through prescribed burning and wildland fire use. However, some of my colleagues speculate that we have perhaps a 10-year window to reintroduce fire at a landscape scale and still have effective control over fire behavior. But beyond that, we may lose this control due to climate changes and the temperature changes pointed out here. In rural communities, it's getting even late now to even address some of these needs for land use zoning, revised building codes, and enforceable vegetation management ordinances. Climate change is going to create more fire-prone environments. We have to break the cycle of new homes being rebuilt in the same places with the same materials as the homes that were destroyed by the last fire. Ideally, our goal should be to create a fireproof set of structures that are able to dwell sustainably in a fire-permeable landscape. We need to be proactive, not reactive, to manage wildland fires in a changing climate. Our traditional strategies that focused on prevention and suppression have become increasingly ineffective and unsustainable. Large wildfires defy our ability to put them out. They often burn until the weather changes. The attempt to extinguish all fires has in fact caused huge cost to taxpayers, significant environmental damage, and put firefighters at unnecessary risk. It's important to acknowledge that there are forces in nature that cannot be controlled, and perhaps megafires should be viewed like hurricanes, earthquakes, and volcanic eruptions, natural disturbances that we must adapt to since we cannot prevent them. This is not fatalism, but instead a plea for realism and a change from reactive fire suppression to proactive fire management.
I thank the witness. Witness's time has expired, and you'll have plenty of time in the question and answer period to expound upon your points. Our next witness, Michael Francis, is the Deputy Vice President for Public Policy and the Director of the National Forest Program at the Wilderness Society. He is a nationally recognized expert on these issues. We welcome you, Mr. Francis. Whenever you're ready, please begin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I'm accompanied today by Dr. Tom DeLuca, who's sitting behind me here, a forest ecologist from our Montana office, who's going to be available to answer questions that go well beyond my pay grade. First, our thoughts are with all those whose lives, homes, and livelihoods threatened by the recent fires. We also salute the firefighters, risking their lives, as well as the many community volunteers that help affected communities. Their efforts, bravery, and determination to demonstrate that America's sense of community is alive and well. Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, there are 5 key points the Wilderness Society would like to leave with you today. They are: 1, wildland fire is regular and healthy occurrence in forest ecosystems. Our forests have evolved over the last 10,000 years on the North American continent, and fire has been a critical ecological process. We have learned that we cannot stop the fires and we cannot exclude them from the forest. And slowly, I think the country is beginning to understand that we must be fire tolerant in fire dependent ecosystems. Second, our climate is changing. One is already, as we have a distinguished panel member here, it states about the impact of temperature increase and water regimes. One of the points I pick out from the IPC report is its projection that precipitation will decrease in the southwestern U.S. and will cause drought through much of the 21st century. Historically, increases in fire increases corresponds to warmer, drier periods. 3, climate change makes forests more susceptible to changes in wildland fire behavior and in the seasons. Warmer winters contribute to summer drought. Reductions in snowpack depth and duration alter timing and volumes of water runoff, leading to longer summer droughts, larger water deficits, and more severe fire seasons. The changing climate and fire behavior calls for changing U.S. Forest Service management policy direction to one of ecological restoration, stewardship to restore and maintain forest resiliency in the face of global warming. 4. Wildland fire in the long term is at least carbon neutral and potentially negative. Harvesting trees will not stop fires, or will such harvests avert the causes or impacts of climate change. There is cycled carbon and non-cycled carbon. Forest carbon represents the type that constantly cycles through the environment, such as the carbon that humans exhale and wildfires release. Fossil fuels represents the type that nature permanently stored in the earth. All carbon released in a fire has been cycling back and forth between the forest and the atmosphere for millennia. Fire changes the location and the state of the carbon in the system, but it does not change the amount. About 5 to 10% of the biomass killed by a wildland fire is converted into charcoal, a uniquely stable form of carbon which will remain stored for thousands of years. Also, forest regeneration after fires recaptures carbon lost during the fires. In other words, over the long run, fire may help forests store carbon, not release it. 5. Targeted fuels reduction around communities can reduce the threat of wildland fire to people, their homes, and their communities. The wildland fire triangle says that 3 factors that affect fire behavior: topography, weather, and fuels. Though weather will increasingly play the trump card in the influencing fire behavior, managing fuels will continue to be important. Research shows that hazardous fuels reduction treatments in appropriate types of fire regimes and locations are often effective in decreasing the severity of subsequent fires. However, it is not feasible nor recommended that all forests be thinned. Faced with decades of long fire seasons and the near certainty of large blazes across the landscape, it is more important now than ever before to apply the tools of hazardous fuels reduction surgically and scientifically. Without exception, the first priority of hazardous fuels reduction and fire management should be keeping families safe and protecting communities. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Francis, very much. The chair will now recognize himself for a round of questions. I asked the Chief Kimball on the first panel if she considered global warming's impacts on wildfires a threat to the public welfare. I'd like to ask each of you if you could briefly tell me if you believe that it is. Dr. Running.
Well, I think there's no question that we look at the climate trends that we're documenting. We look at the projected trends that the GCMs predict for the future, and we see the current acceleration of wildfire and the acceleration of people building homes in fire-prone areas. I mean, it just all adds up to this issue getting bigger and bigger.
Okay,
and
Dr.
not
Mendler,
going away.
please.
Well, I'd like to concur with Dr. Running. There's a whole set of complicated issues that come together, but clearly most of the models and many of our predictions indicate we're going to be seeing increased fire behavior, fire severity.
Because of global warming.
I'm willing to say that, yeah.
Okay,
And
great. Mr. Francis.
I guess I would say just ditto to what my colleagues have said, because it is one aspect that we're going to see as a result of global warming. So it is a threat, as global warming is a threat.
Okay, now again, we had an online question that came in, and that was the gentleman from Missouri who emailed us a question, and it was, as experts in fire science or forest policy, do you worry about the expansion of wildfires across the country to areas that have not typically experienced them and may be unprepared to deal with them? And relate it to global warming, please. Dr. Running.
Yes, I think we are already seeing areas that have not had historical fire, that with forests under more stress, this is an expectation that you would get from ecosystem theory.
Okay, Dr. Mendler.
Well, yeah, to continue, there's plenty of evidence that we're seeing these changes in fire behavior. There's also land management issues that have left large fuel buildups in some areas, not such a significant problem in others. And climate change in particular will make a lot of these areas vulnerable to fire beyond our historical expectations. And in many areas where we may not be used to seeing it quite as often before. I worked previously in New Jersey, and we were getting surprised by large 40, 50,000 acre fires.
And you're
there.
you relate that to global warming?
That was 5, 6 years ago. I would be hesitant to do that.
Okay, great. Mr. Francis?
I'd like to defer that answer to Dr. Tom DeLuca from.
Okay, good. Thank you. Doctor, could you identify yourself for the record, please?
My name is Tom DeLuca. I'm a senior scientist with the Wilderness Society.
Could you speak up a little bit? And
Yes,
okay.
my name is Tom DeLuca.
Okay, fine, yes.
Okay, sorry. As Dr. Steve Running had pointed out, temperatures are increasing with climate change, and we have associated with that temperature change the same ecosystems that had exist in these locations under lower temperatures. So the long and short of it is, yes, we're going to see higher biomass. We have higher biomass than would exist in that temperature environment, and those ecosystems will experience fires that would not be characteristic necessarily of that landscape.
Now, Mr. Francis, some people have alleged that environmental groups are somehow responsible for the increase in wildfire because they have blocked projects to remove brush or to do controlled burns in order to protect the rest of the forest. But in 2003, the GAO found that 97% of these type of projects go forward without any opposition at all. How would you respond to the allegations that litigation by environmental groups is actually responsible for the wildfires?
I would respond and say, look at the GAO report. I mean, the fact is that 97% of these projects make it through in a time that is set out by the law. A few do get litigated because they are bad projects. They're not projects that are supportable by science or the public. I mean, the chief really talked about the public dialogue and the public being involved in looking at what happens around their communities, and therefore you need to involve that public. And the Forest Service has a good record of having an appeals system that allows the public to participate when they strongly disagree, and that's part of the process. It doesn't, as the GAO says, it doesn't really delay anything on that project.
Dr. Running, could you respond to that briefly?
Oh, I really have nothing more to add than what I see around Montana, and that is that there are occasionally have been appeals that take a number of years to work through for things like salvage logging after fires, and the value of the timber is then lost while the appeal process goes through. But those, I don't have specific knowledge of the details on those.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Running. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Washington State, Mr. Inslee.
Thank you. I want to welcome Dr. Mendler from Western Washington here. If you ever see a student named Joe on campus, tell him to do his homework, if you will. And you have some great students up there who've been working on clean energy issues. I'm going to be talking to some of them about this book, Apollo's Fire, about a clean energy future for the country. And I note that because my sort of sense of your professional work, and I really appreciate your professional work, all three of you in this regard, but I really do believe there's, as long as global warming continues to ravage these forests, there's really nothing going to significantly change the devastation occurring as long as we have these huge changes in the climactic system. And if that's true, it's incumbent upon us to develop a clean energy system that will indeed stop global warming to save these forests. And when I mean save them, I got to tell you, it's just astounding to me. You know, we talk about this academically, but when you're up there in the mountains and you just see mile after mile after mile of dead trees, it's just stunning. And I've been hiking those places for 56 years. So I guess I'd ask for your comment on that position. Is that really the fundamental thing we have to do to save these forests, which is to stop this human-caused climactic change? I'd ask for any of your comments.
Well, I'd chime in, agreeing with Mr. Francis here that we have a complicated situation in that fire and ecosystem processes are just a part of this. As you're pointing out, in a global climate change situation, if we're not going to deal with the global climate change issue itself, we're going to be stuck with immensely problematic forest management issues. Mr. Walden pointed out that we have estimates as high as 190 million acres that are in need of some sort of treatment, and this includes the kinds of forests you're talking about that I'm also very familiar with literally hundreds of acres, hundreds of thousands of acres at a time of what look like dead trees. Those are massive numbers. 190 million acres is not the kind of area that you can thin by hand and clear out. The fire is the process we're going to need to reintroduce to do a lot of that treatment, but that's extraordinarily complicated because of policies that put housing digitized in there that's completely unprotectable. So one of the critical elements, at least from the forest management perspective, is to let us use fire as a tool where it can help, and to do that we need to protect communities. As for your question about global climate change itself, I would concur that we need to deal with the imbalances Mr. Francis was talking about. The globe as a system has had a certain amount of carbon in the biosphere and the atmosphere for quite some time, and that's what we're changing now by reintroducing carbon that can be tens, hundreds of millions of years old, changing the total balance of the system and changing temperatures that allow insects to have 2 reproductive cycles, or maybe more importantly survive through the winter. In Canada, directly north of where I live, there's massive areas of insect damage fire waiting to happen. There's literally millions of acres of dead trees, as you're pointing out. It's staggering when you drive through some of these large areas, and they can be directly attributed to what seem like subtle temperature changes, just enough to allow, for example, insects to survive the winter.
I heard, I think it was maybe Mr. Francis say that, or maybe I read it in one of your testimonies, that actually the fire season is increased 78 days. Is that correct? Can you, what percentage increase is that? I don't know how many days the fire season is.
Well, the fire season is obviously different in different climates, but that's on the order of 20 to 30% increase in number of days, and we expect another 20 or 30% increase with the climate model projections for the future. And so that we're in the middle of a trend that has been progressing for 30 to 40 years, and there's no reason to believe it's going to slow down with any of the climate model projections we see.
Well, I think that suggests that we need to get going in Washington, D.C. to do something about climate change. And I have to tell you, we're in the cusp of doing that. We're making some progress here. We need a president who won't stand in the way of progress to save these forests. And I appreciate you're trying to spread the word about this, because you know, not only the forest is going to burn, but we're going to have people on that interface in danger too. So thanks so much for your professional work. Thank you.
Great. Gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Cleaver.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like for the three of you to get the comments from the three of you on this issue. I've always been fascinated by, hopefully it wasn't cynicism, but I've always been fascinated by people who build their homes on cliffs and then seem stunned when they fall during a mudslide. And maybe it's because I can't afford to build one, and it's amazing to me. And I'm now becoming a little concerned about people who build their homes in areas that are prone to wildfires previously, now the mega fires. And the concern is more than for the home. If wildfires represent about 10% of the greenhouse gases, as is being suggested by science, that's one level of a problem that has an adverse effect on human beings. But the one that's troubling me more is the prospect of airborne particles that result from a wildfire. The PM10s, the 10 micrometers and smaller particles that come up that apparently the mask cannot filter, that they're so small that they penetrate the masks that are being used in the area to protect human beings. Do you think we are going to approach a time when we might need to discourage people from living in areas that could be ignited quickly, where a mega wildfire could start? We've got the greenhouse emissions, and now the microparticles that, and I'm not sure what kind of medical damage that's doing. It's not going to be helpful. So do any of you have?
Well, let me first address the immediate public health issue you bring up. In Missoula, Montana this summer for over a month, we were under first a stage 1, and then I think we reached a stage 2 air pollution alert from the wildfires. And this meant that all the football teams weren't practicing. They were encouraging people with breathing problems to stay indoors. I mean, this went on for weeks and weeks in our community, a very immediate public health issue because of the wildfire smoke. So there's no doubt that when you're in these wildfires and in the downwind of these smoke plumes, it is an immediate health issue for the public. I think the longer term of where we have structures built, it's very much like people building all the coastline houses in the hurricane areas and with sea level rise. The same thing, that we've allowed structures to be built in places that are non-defensible, and I think we're reaching that same sort of issue in the forests, forested land around the country with this fire issue now. And I think while I have the mic, I'll certainly reiterate also, in the long run, only reducing our fossil fuel emissions is going to get us ahead of this problem.
Mm-hmm. So essentially, you're saying that there could be some damage to the human creature as well as the other creatures, and that, being in the United States, we have the constitutional right to be stupid.
That's correct.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, great. We thank each of our witnesses. Let's ask you to do this in reverse order. And let's tell you what we'll do. We'll allow the gentleman accompanying you, Mr. Francis, to also give us the 1 minute you want us to each remember about this relationship between global warming and wildfires, and try to summarize it in 1 minute, the parting shot that you want us to each remember.
Climate change is causing an increase in the occurrence and size of wildfires in the United States. Wildfire, on the other hand, is a natural process that is necessary in our forest environments. Wildfires should be allowed to burn in natural landscapes that are far from the community zone and that have the opportunity to reinvigorate those forests and reduce the fuel loading in those forests over the long term and maintain the healthy, vigorous forests that Gail Kimball referred to today. Intense efforts should be made in the wildland-urban interface to reduce the fuel loading and protect those structures and the firefighters and people's lives.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Francis.
I'll pick up from where Tom left off about the wildland-urban interface. We need to be, in this next century, in order to protect our population and protect the people, we need to be concentrating our resources into the wildland-urban interface in and around these communities. We also need to be providing resources to the local communities to be able to help themselves and do that through the State Fire Assistance Program is one of the things that we mentioned in our testimony. The fact is, communities working together and doing the planning for their own protection and their own survival is an important aspect, and it's where you get that type of project that doesn't get appealed when you have the community participation and collaboration.
Thank you. Dr. Mendler.
Well, I'd like to continue off some of those thoughts and go back to some of the questions. We have huge areas in the backcountry that are going to burn. Prescribed fire, controlled fire would probably involve less smoke, and there's a tricky decision that's going to need to be made there. Last year, the San Diego Declaration on Climate Change and Fire Management was formally ratified at the Third International Fire Ecology and Management Congress. We had over 1,200 people there, scientists and managers. This document, historic document, really presents a synopsis of the best available science and efforts of climate change and wildfire scientists, and we provide with that a list of action items. And I'd like to enter the full San Diego Declaration into the record along with my testimony.
Without objection, it will be included. And I thank you, Dr. Mendler. It will be included in the record. Dr. Running, the final word.
And the final word. I think what all of us as IPCC authors want to make clear to the public is that this warming trend we're on is human-induced. We are already seeing the early signs of a whole-scale transition of our entire landscape. Really, what we're seeing with these wildfires is a natural process where a drier ecosystem ends up being replaced because it can't be supported with the current climate that's now occurring. And the only way we're ever going to get ahead of this issue is to reduce our fossil fuel emissions down to rebalance the global carbon budget.
Thank you, Dr. Running, and again, congratulations on the role you played in helping the United Nations win the Nobel Peace Prize. And we thank each of you for your contribution here today. This is a subject that I think over the next year we're going to return over and over again. It is a central part of the whole storyline of global warming, the causation by human beings and its effect subsequently on human beings yet again. So we thank you, and with that, this hearing is adjourned.